welcome all, well, there was 112 pre-registered, so I think we're close to 112 of you here to the Regional Economic Development Summit for the Treasure Coast region. You know, somebody told me just the other day recently, and I don't want to steal Mark Wilson's thunder here, but that on a list of economies, world economies from around the world, Florida sits somewhere between Saudi Arabia and Mexico as the 16th largest economy in the world. Now the Treasure Coast, think about that, the 16th largest economy in the world, that's Florida. Think about the Treasure Coast region, and depending on whose numbers you look at, about 10 to 15% of that productivity, that contribution to the 16th largest economy in the world comes from the Treasure Coast region, Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River County. So that tells me two things right away. One thing, I think we should be proud and also grateful to live in a state and a region like the Treasure Coast. But also it tells me that we all have an important role to play, and I think even an obligation with collaborating with all our partners here and making sure that we continue our competitiveness and strengthen our role in not just the Florida's economy, but the global economy as well. So let that sit in your mind for a minute. Just a couple things about the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, your host today, and my boss, my employer, and its role in economic development. And it has a long historic role in economic development, and since its establishment in 1976, and its designation as a federal economic development district, the Regional Planning Council's mission has always been, well, really two things. Number one, and the word is support and collaborate on economic development initiatives with several of our partners. That includes local governments who are always trying to move forward with infrastructure and things to set a better table for the private sector and a better table for its citizens. All the local economic development organizations that are here today and who aren't, career source boards, school superintendents, universities and the university presidents, the healthcare providers in the industry there, and all the large and small business operators and owners that we've touched over the years with our small business loan programs and other programs to help them continue business. And number two, and this is something that many of you, maybe you haven't thought about this, but when the Regional Planning Council started in the 1960s, the big mission was to position those regions, all right, position them for the best possible access for state and federal private infrastructure dollars, all right. A region tends to have a little bit more power, and the game today is regional, especially at the Fed, to bring those dollars home. So when you look at your program today, I'll move on. When you look at your program today, it's in two pieces. The morning is devoted to education and panel discussions, just to inform us a little bit about some of the challenges and trends that we're seeing today in Florida, and the trends that are going to be affecting Florida's economy and this region's economy. That's the first part. Now, our after lunch part of the program is going to be devoted to our breakout groups, and they're all organized under the Florida Chamber's 6 pillars. Plus one area that I spoke of earlier, the economic resilience area. Now the results of your participation, and really one of the main reasons for bringing you all together, is to help us inform and develop what's called the Treasure Coast Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy Plan, or CEDS plan, okay? This plan really just serves as a guide for all the regional and local collaboration that we do on economic development initiatives and planning. And also it helps us qualify the Regional Planning Council and this region to gain access to those state and federal funds for economic development and infrastructure. Okay, a couple more things before we get to our first speaker. I know I'm on a clock, which is hard for me. First, that was kind of a joke. Thanks, Nikki. Nikki got it. Those of you who know me got it. So first, I just need to thank and recognize everyone out there who has made this summit possible, but thank you for all of you again for coming. But to Indian River State College, you got to do this because you never get a chance at the end to do it. Everybody's running around and leaving. So Indian River State College and the staff, I know Dr. Massey, I don't see him here today. He'll be here later. But thank you for allowing their staff to work so closely with our staff and making this venue kind of a perfect place to have this summit. Also like to thank MCTV for setting up and filming today, and I have authorization to say this, that all their programming, we're going to make it available to Palm Beach County TV, Port St. Lucie TV, St. Lucie TV, and all the local access channels, Indian River TV also. All the members of the Treasure Coast SEDS Committee, I don't know how many of you are here. Could you stand up, the SEDS Committee, Treasure Coast SEDS Committee? It's not too much trouble? Wow. Okay, there's more of you than I thought. Thank you. I know the chair is here today from the SEDS Committee, Michael Corbett, and a little bit about them is in your program and what they do and what their function is. Mike will be serving as one of our moderators today, but I'd all like to thank the SEDS Committee especially for sort of motivating us to do this and sort of helping us get this thing done in this kind of fashion here. You guys like this? Okay. You don't know. We'll see how it works. We may do it again. All the elected officials and Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council members, I have a list. I know the registered, some may not be here, but I'm going to read this list to you. I'm always fearful because I may miss somebody. But Linda Bartz, City Council person with City of Port St. Lucie, Joe Flesher, Commissioner Flesher from Indian River County. I know Maria Marino is here, City Council, Palm Beach Gardens. Thanks. Chris Zadofsky, St. Lucie County Commissioner. Commissioner Ed Fielding from Martin County is here today. Mayor Ann Gerwig from the Village of Wellington. Commissioner Haddix from Martin County. Commissioner Smith from Martin County. Also, Tim Zork from Indian River County Board of County Commissioners is here. I don't see him today, but if anybody sees him before I do, tell him that there are Rice Krispie treats for him at the snack, so he won't be disappointed. And Kevin Foley, former chair and 26-year member of the Regional Planning Council, is here today, also a governor's appointee. It's not bad for 26 years, all those different governors, and they still kept him appointed to our board, so they didn't know him, right? Staff of the Regional Planning Council, I can't thank, I don't know who to thank for my staff. They're the best in the state. I can't tell you that they make me look good every day and every night, even though when I don't deserve it. And so they've worked very, very hard, especially Peter Merritt, Assistant Director with the Council, to get this done. We have the former Executive or Economic Development Coordinator for the Council, Greg DeVide. He used to work for us. Where is Greg? Okay, he is now our guy with the Fed. He's got a job with the U.S. Department of Commerce and EDA. He's our Florida representative. So get to know Greg. And when Greg left, Peter Merritt took over the program, and he has done an excellent job working with the SEDS committee and running the program for a region and organizing this event. So we just hired somebody new, though. Tom Lanahan is new on our staff. Please get to know Tom. He's got a world of private sector and public sector experience. He's a real pro, so I think you'll like him. He's going to be taking over the economic development program shortly, so, or now, soon. Get right to our first speaker and introduce Mark Wilson from the Florida Chamber of Commerce. Many of you know Mark, some of you don't. Mark serves as the president and CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce. I believe they're probably one of the most influential business advocacy organizations in Florida. If you don't know Mark, if you don't know the Chamber, you need to. The Florida Chamber is commonly known as the voice of business in Florida and has fought for years to secure the Florida's future through legislative advocacy, grassroots action, political leadership, and also research-based solutions to help Florida's competitiveness. The RPC statewide have been proud partners and members of the Florida Chamber for quite a while, and we're really happy that we are. Now, Mark, besides serving as president and CEO of the Florida Chamber, Mark also serves on the board of directors of Enterprise Florida, and you'll see a common theme here in just a minute. He's on the board of Leadership Florida, the Florida Chamber Foundation, the Council of State Chambers. He's also a member of the American Chamber of Commerce Executive, the Florida Association of Chamber Professionals, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Committee of 100. So you see the theme here? I think Mark really loves chambers. And all I know is that we're lucky to have him working for us in Florida, and we're honored to have him with us here today. So let's give Mark a big hand. Thank you, Mark.
All right, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And So here's what we get to do for the next 40 minutes or so. I was asked when Michael and I talked a couple months ago, he talked to me about the significance of what you're going to be doing today. And as we designed the next little bit of the program, we thought it might be a really good idea to try to give some context to where Florida is and where Florida is going, and then what we see about the entire region, really as a way to sort of set up the decisions and conversations that you all have to get to have throughout the day. And so thank you for that introduction. Of all those things I get to do, you missed that I get to work with Beth Kegel as well at the Northern Palm Beaches Chamber. So Beth, thanks for being here to be on the front row to just heckle me during this entire program today. I too brought some questions that I wanted to start off with, and so Michael, thank you for making sure that the devices actually work. Before we get into questions though, I want to tell you that I think one of the most important parts of this next segment are going to be your questions back to me. And so the way that this is planned is that I'm going to share with you quite a bit of information about where Florida is and where we're going. And then we're going to turn it back to you, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. I may or may not know the answers to them, but I think your questions are very informative about what's on your mind, and maybe we can answer them throughout the day. So that's the program, that's the plan. So could we go ahead and hit the first question on that poll? So pretty simple. Do you think Florida is headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? Okay. Is that enough time, Michael? All right. Let's see what you think. Okay. So right direction 74, wrong direction 26. Let me tell you why I started off with that question. I started off with that question because I had a feeling that's what you would say. Okay? Here's the challenge with the hard work that you have to get through today. That is not how the voters of Florida feel. So the people at the city, at the county, at the state, federal level that are actually pushing red buttons and green buttons, they're actually paying attention not to what the professionals who do this for a living think. They're paying attention to where does that next vote come from. And by the way, they're not doing anything any different than any successful business is doing. They're listening to their customers. So before we blame politicians for that, the reality of it is they're doing what they need to do to make their constituents and customers happy. So I start with this to tell you the toughest job that we all have to do today is to figure out, if you know what the right answer is, what do we need to do differently in Florida over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years to be more inclusive, to more community-based conversations about how do we get everybody to understand what the right answer is? And then how do we coalesce around what the right answer is? So speaking of the right answer, if we go to the next slide, well actually, actually go back one if you would, I'm sorry. Unlike Michael, I don't have the right answer for you up here. And so let me tell you what the voters of Florida have said. 47% of voters think we're headed in the right direction, 33% wrong. But if you go back, we've done 40 polls since August at the Florida Chamber. And if you go back, if you look over the last couple of months, or if you look over the last 10 years, 47% right direction is the highest I've seen it in a long time. It's been tied in the low 40s, high 30s. So people at the moment, only 47%, but they think we're headed in the right direction. Men think we're headed in the right direction at a higher percentage than women. Republicans think we're headed in the right direction at a much higher percentage than Democrats. So just keep in mind, 76% of you think we're headed in the right direction is incredibly optimistic. And please, as you plan today, don't think that that's where the politicians that we all get to work with, that's not what they're hearing when they're talking to their bosses. So just keep that in mind. So let's flip. Next question has to do with the size of our economy, okay? So you talked a little bit about this earlier, and I appreciate that. So the question is this: if you take Florida's GDP, right, which one of those are we? And if you can't read them, 20th largest economy in the world, 20th largest global economy, 1% of the global GDP, about the size of Mexico's GDP, or a quarter of the size of Singapore's. Okay? Let's see what you think. Okay, so most of you think we're the 20th largest global economy. The next answer is about the size of Mexico. The correct answer is B. So we're actually the 16th largest economy in the world, if we were a country, but we're 1% of the global GDP, right? So the reason I start off with this, Florida's a big deal. And I would ask you to think in terms of not one county versus another or one state versus another, but the decisions you're going to be making today and in the next few years, we need to be asking the question, what does this do for Florida on a global stage? Does the decision you're making advantage Florida jobs on a global stage? We have to start asking that question. So, by the way, Greece, right? We've all heard about Greece's economy in the last 5 and 10 years. The entire economy of Greece would fit inside of the economy of Miami. Cuba, we've all heard about Cuba, right? Is Cuba a big deal? Not a big deal? Certainly is politically a big deal, but from an economic standpoint, the entire economy of Cuba would fit inside of Tampa. So Florida's a big deal. We need to come to the equation understanding globally we're a big deal, but in order to remain relevant, we have to see ourselves as a global competitor. So let's go to the next question. So we're talking about venture capital here. And if you don't know what that is, don't answer the question. If you know what it is, please weigh in here. So the question is, venture capital is just, it's a measure of entrepreneurial activity and what are we doing to create innovation into commercialization opportunities, right? And so the question is, it's a fill in the blank. Every how many days California gets as much venture capital as Florida gets in a year, right? Let's see what you think. Okay, so you got it right. So every 5 days, the state of California gets as much venture capital as Florida gets in a year. If we look at foreign direct investment, which is a measure I would implore all of you to put in your plans, right? If we look at foreign direct investment, California gets as much foreign direct investment every month as Florida gets in a year. Yet Florida is positioned perfectly to gain ground on this. And so let's go to the next one. Okay, we just missed a big one with Matthew, right? Okay, and Florida, it's a fact of life that we need to talk about disasters, we need to talk about resiliency, and we really need to learn. We can be the best place in the world for how to get this right, and we can actually export what we learn, we can commercialize this, but we have to get it right. So the question is this, how much of the world's hurricane risk, think about property values. How much of the world's hurricane risk is here in Florida? Not of the countries, of the world's hurricane risk. Okay, see what you said. Okay, so most of you think Florida is 12% of the world's hurricane risk. The next answer was 31%. Truth is, we're half. Half of all the hurricane risk on the planet is right here in the state of Florida. So this conversation about resiliency, right? What are we doing with building? What are we doing to educate our public? Huge issue for our state. Florida's been getting it right in the last decade, but a lot of room to grow. Be thinking about how can we be so excellent at this that we can actually export it to other parts of the world. And that'll make more sense when we get to the next slide. Okay, so I think this may be my last question, maybe one more. But remember I talked about global, the significance of thinking globally? In 2000, right, if you can think about that, 5% of the Fortune 500 companies, right, talking about global Fortune 500 companies, were in emerging countries. Right, we all know what that means. What's it going to be in 2035? So if it was 5% in 2000, what's it going to be in 2035? 20 years from now, basically. All right, let's see what you think. Okay, yeah, there you have it. So This is real life, folks. You know, a lot of people grew up in the days thinking that Fortune 500 companies were unique to America, right? But if you look out just 20 years, you start thinking about nearly half of the world's Fortune 500 companies are going to be in countries that are developing and emerging. That is a global economy, and I think we have to be thinking. We might think a permitting decision is a local decision. A permitting decision has to do with, well, how are we going to compete with Brazil? How are we going to compete with other countries, right? So let's be thinking about that. Okay, I think that was the last question. Well, Michael reminded me I have more. By the way, there's not a right answer to this question. This is more about asking you about the talent pipeline. So when it comes to our workforce, talent pipeline, think of our education systems, whether that's pre-K, K-12, higher ed, career source. What would you say? Strong and improving, strong but weakening, weak but improving, weak and getting worse. All right, let me see what you said. So let's look at that for a second. All right? If Michael jumped up and said, we're changing the schedule, you have 2 more minutes and then you have to go. What I would tell you, the most important thing I can share with you is this. There's a big conversation going on in this country right now, and Ground Zero is Florida, about economic development and about incentives. The Koch brothers, you may have heard if you've been paying any attention, want to get rid of all economic development organizations in America. They want to get rid of all EDCs, they want to get rid of EFI, and they want to get rid of all taxpayer incentives. And that's significant in its own right, but it's also significant because we all have to step back from the emotions of that conversation, and we have to ask ourselves, where do most jobs come from in the first place? So here's the reality of the situation based on our research. Incentives are almost always inappropriate and are rarely ever used. Now those are fighting words for a lot of people, so let me explain what I mean. If you look at the 1.2 million jobs that Florida businesses have created in the last 5.5 or so years, fewer than 1% have been created via an incentive. So the point is this. 99+% of jobs that are created because a small or a mid-sized business said, now's the time to add 2 people, now's the time to add 12, now's the time to add another driver, now's the time to invest here. So that means our regulatory climate, our tax climate, our infrastructure climate, that means our availability of a trained and skilled workforce is going to be the difference between whether Florida succeeds and flourishes or whether we fail. Keep that in mind. So here's what I say everywhere I get a chance to talk about this. Talent is replacing the incentive as the most important tool in the economic development toolkit. Why else would a company be in California or in Seattle? These are god-awful places to do business. They have horrible business climates, but the talent's there. Why would venture capital be there? It's because the talent's there. So the number one thing we have to get right is we have to figure out, how do you make that strength and improving? Everything we do should be about the workforce. I'll talk more about that if we have time later. Okay, let's move on. All right, so I put some remarks together that we've been working on for about a month, and they're tied back to what Michael asked me to talk about. So normally, the Florida Chamber's asked to talk about the long term. Where's Florida going to be in 20 years? Or we're asked to come talk about elections because we have a huge political operation. Or we're asked to come talk about what the legislature's doing and what's the short-term legislative agenda, what do we need to do in Tallahassee next year. I didn't come here today to talk about any of that. What I actually did is I threw it all together in a blender, and I want to try to quickly walk you through kind of all of what's Florida going through right now, really so that you have the same information we have as you go through today and you make some decisions. So our top job, right, if you came to our building, you would see what's on the front of our building is a phrase that says securing Florida's future. That is our top job right? Who's in charge of the future of Florida? When we look out to 2030 and 2040, and you start seeing what we have to get right, we think the business community is the one that has the most at stake, right? We have to get our environment right. We have to get water right. We have to get transportation right. And our whole education system, the business community has the most to win or lose if we get it right or don't get it right. So be thinking about that. So it's all about how do we make Florida more competitive, right? How do we reach our potential by making Florida more competitive? And I don't care if it's a permitting discussion, an infrastructure discussion, regulatory issue. How does Florida do compared to what our potential is? Okay? So this could very easily be, if somebody could boil this down to a book cover, this is really what I want to talk about. And by the way, this was what we talked about at our Future of Florida Forum. Some of you were there. And here's the point. If Florida was a stock, right, and this is a question I wish I would have asked all of you. If Florida was a stock, would you buy it? The reality of it is I'd be buying all of it that I could possibly afford. When you look at our fundamentals, they're incredibly strong. The problem with that is I could also stand up here for an hour and tell you about all the things that are going wrong. And so remember I said right direction, wrong direction? And how there's a lot of people in Florida who think we're going in the wrong direction. The truth is, politically speaking, it's very popular these days to stand up here and point out what's wrong. And the reality of it is, think about your answers. 76% of you think we're headed in the right direction. It's because this is what you do every day. You're seeing that we're moving our state forward. You're seeing how we're doing compared to other states. The average Floridian is not seeing that. Right? Think about what they're hearing about on Facebook. Think about what they're hearing about from their friends, right? Be thinking about that as we go forward. Also, and I've given this metaphor before, so I hope you don't mind me using it again. If we're not careful, this is like an aircraft carrier, right? But imagine an aircraft carrier with 5,000 outboard motors on it, and everybody gets to point it in the direction that they want it to go in. That's a lot different than saying we're going this direction, and we're doing it in 10 minutes, right? You want 12,000 people to be aligned behind where we're going, the right GPS coordinates, what's my role, who's rowing, who's doing navigation. And I just want to point out the difference between a consensus conversation where everybody gets to point their outboard motor the direction that they want, and the conversation about let's measure twice and cut once. It's a decision we all have to make increasingly in Florida. So what you're looking at up here, and hopefully you can read it in the back, the bottom line is this: everything you know about our state is changing. Our demographics are changing, our politics are changing, and our economics are changing. And so what I want to do in the time I have remaining is try to walk you through and demonstrate what some of those economic, demographic, and political changes look like. Next slide, please. Big picture context. Let's talk about what's going on in America, right? And these slides are going to be available. Michael, you can do whatever you want to with them later. But here's the federal outlook. And if you can't read the words in the back, let me just explain to you. The pie chart on the left is, the time frame is 2000. And if you see the blue, that's federal mandatory spending, right? Think about entitlements, right? That takes money away from transportation, from infrastructure, from all of the things we know are economic development, okay? Now fast forward to last year, you can see over 75% of the federal budget is tied up in mandates and entitlements. Now fast forward, go out to just 10 years, right? 99% of the federal budget is mandated. So where are they going to find the dollars without major entitlement reform, without spending reform? Where are they going to find the dollars to do all the things that we know need to be done? I'm giving you that because I wish I were here telling you those slides were reversed and that I was optimistic that in 5 years, 10 years, we're going to start seeing influxes of federal resources being available for significant infrastructure projects. I think the data tells us it's going to be the other way around. which means we've got to really figure out how in the world are we going to prioritize and how in the world are we going to fund this, right? Now, Winston Churchill said, you know, the thing about America is they always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. So I'm telling you right now, everybody knows that train wreck is coming. Everybody. Nobody wants to do anything about it in elected office. And so my guess is we'll get to the end of that, we'll have the crash, and everybody will figure out how to reset it. But in the meantime, I don't think I would be making assumptions that there's big chunks of dollars available coming from above. Last thing, next slide. Last thing I want to say about the federal environment that we're in, and you might take this politically. I don't mean it politically, but it's context for us, okay? So I testified in Congress earlier this year on overcoming generational poverty, right? So in Florida, we have 3.6 million or so people living in poverty right now. And so here's the point I want to make to you. I'm not here today to talk to you about poverty. I'm here to talk to you today about the context that we're operating in. In my lifetime, if you look at what we're dealing with right now, I have never seen things as partisan as they are right now. And some of you would argue with me about an era in the past where it was more partisan. It's fine. I don't want to fight about it. But I think we're more paranoid today than we've ever been. So if I stand up here and I put a good idea out here and I say, by the way, I'm a Democrat, half of you say it's a horrible idea. And I could give you the same idea and say Republican, and the other half of the room says, well, that's a bad idea, I don't trust that person. And so all of a sudden, a generation ago, I could stand up here and talk about we need to create good jobs for everyone in our community. And it didn't matter if you were a Democrat, Republican, or something else. Everybody would say, yes, that's the goal. Now let's argue about how to do it. Folks, that is not even the goal anymore. The goal is how do I get more D's or how do I get more R's? And this whole business about getting trained, getting a good education, getting into the workforce and bettering yourself, here's my point. The argument I made to Congress when I testified earlier this year was, look, the battle that's going on is we believe, and I'm not saying you do, we believe that economic opportunity is what we should die on the sword for. Every kid, every adult should have an equal opportunity at education, at bettering themselves. But there's a growing group of people who want equal outcomes, right? That is not what we believe in, right? So I'm not asking you to agree with us, disagree with this, don't throw something at me or anything like that. My point is, this is the environment you're all trying to make decisions in. And don't think for a minute that everyone sees the world the same way you do. These big fights are real, they're going on. Let's go. Okay. Economic development, I mentioned this earlier. Some of you may remember Leary Jenkins from Reynolds, Smith & Hill, past chair of the chamber, or Glenda Hood, former mayor of Orlando, first female chair of the Florida Chamber way back when. Way back in the 90s, we did a cornerstone project at the Florida Chamber Foundation called Enterprise Florida. And what we were recommending is that we close down the Department of Commerce and create a public-private partnership that would essentially focus on diversifying Florida's economy, right? Remember, agriculture, tourism, construction have always been the foundation of Florida's economy, and they always will. But the early research started to say we need more. We don't need to get past it, we need to build on top of it, right? Life sciences, bio, advanced manufacturing, et cetera, the targeted industries. So after we did the report, and Pete Tesh, you and I were talking about this earlier, after we put that report out in the early 90s, you know, what do you know? An organization was created called Enterprise Florida. So 20 years later, after lots of successes and some not successes, 20 years later we have a new political fight going on about should we get rid of that organization, should we get rid of incentives? I'm telling you that story to tell you this. We have an economic development task force that is co-chaired by Leary and Glenda. Glenda used to be our Secretary of State when Governor Bush was here, so she was very involved in Enterprise Florida over the years. We're 7 months into an 11-month project. We have over 200 ideas already that we've heard from the business community to say, okay, in a non-incentive environment, how do you grow Florida's economy? How do you diversify Florida's economy? So that project will be finished in January or February. Some of it we'll work on right away. Some of it will go into our long-term research. All of it will be available for your consideration when the time's right. Let's go. All right. I only want to bring this back for context because this was a long time ago, but does anybody remember this front page article in the Wall Street Journal? Okay, a couple hands. So I remember it. It was on a Saturday morning. I remember it because I was on my way to the U.S. Chamber to Washington, and I was changing planes in Atlanta, and I walked by and I thought, does that say what I think it said? And as some of you have heard me say before, that's a bad day when you're the president of the Florida Chamber, okay? But we had calls from all over the world that day, and by the time I got to Washington, we were talking to the media, and what we basically said is, yeah, you're exactly right. The Florida you talk about, where we're cheap and all about retirees, yeah, that Florida is over. But where have you been? We knew that 10 years ago. We've been focusing on education, focusing on diversifying our economy. When are you going to write the follow-up story that the new Florida has arrived? And so that's a little bit about what I want to talk to you. By the way, when they call me, this is the first question I ask them. Are you calling me to write the follow-up story to your 2006 story? Haven't seen it yet. Let's go. Okay, so I hope there's not a single person in here that hasn't seen or heard of the 6 pillars. The 6 pillars, just like Enterprise Florida came out of our first Cornerstone project, the 6 pillars came out of our most recent Cornerstone project. And we did a $1 million research project that said, where's the world going to be in 20 years? And what are the things that Florida has to get right? Whether you're a city council or the state legislature or a regional planning organization, what are the fundamental frameworks that we have got to get right? Right? And so I didn't bring this up here today to go through these, but this is the framework our Economic Development Task Force is using. This is the framework we're using for the Florida 2030 project. And 6 million more people will call Florida home in 15 years, and we need to create 2 million new jobs over that same period of time. So if we had time to walk through the 6 pillars, I would be asking you things like, okay, in the talent pillar, if you think of early learning, K-12, higher ed, lifelong learning, career source, et cetera, how do we have 260-some thousand open jobs in Florida right now? Right? And how do we, over the next 10 years, how do we in the business community do a better job letting our educators and our talent trainers know what our needs are going to be down the line? I don't blame our educators for the gap. I blame the business community for the gap. And I think the sooner the business community takes ownership and starts doing a better job saying, here's what we're going to need in 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, Florida can actually be advantaged by having this talent pipeline, right? So, not going to go through that whole scenario right now, but let me say a word about water, just as an example, right? So, living in ground zero right now, everybody in this room understands that water is economic development. And so, we need 20% more water by 2030. So, keep that number in mind, okay? With our population gains and our visitors, we need 20% more water. We believe we should focus on what the science says. And I think almost everybody is coalescing around what does the science say. So what happens if a group like this, what happens if we can agree we need 20% more water? We need to do it in a environmentally friendly, science-based way. So what if we make that the goal? And don't pay a whole lot of attention to the political fights that are going to take place around us just because somebody has an R behind their name or a D behind their name. I think it has to be leaders that are going to do that. And by the way, this area, in many ways, is getting it right. And so are there economic opportunities when you find ways to get it right? You know, look, water is an issue all over the globe. This is not, Florida doesn't own this. Could Florida be the world's center of excellence where we research this, we learn it, we solve it, and then could we actually be exporting what we know, and could we be creating jobs right here in Florida to solve this issue all the way around the world? If you think this is a problem for just this area, do yourself a favor and Google it and look around the world. Water is a problem in almost every region of the world. And just like the hurricane issue I talked about before with resiliency, we could actually not only solve this, but we could be an economic opportunity for us as well. All right, let's move on. Okay, so some of you have seen this before, but I think if you haven't, this is for you. If you look contextually at where America was a couple hundred years ago, New York was ground zero. New York was looked at as the most important state in the country, right? It basically led the economy, okay? Then the next century, it was California, right? All of our research tells us that the century we're in right now, Florida becomes the leader, right? And let me give you 2 data points you may not have heard before. So, Michael, you talked about jobs earlier, and I talk a lot about jobs. In America right now, 1 in every 9 jobs in America, new jobs, are created right here in Florida. A year ago, it was 1 in 11. 1 in every 9 jobs in America are created right here in Florida. So the rest of the country is looking at us saying, what are you guys doing? Let me talk about economic diversification for just a second. Our chief economist, Dr. Parrish, actually has a chart where they've looked at all the states in America. And we spend a lot of time talking about how do we diversify Florida's economy, right? If I were to take the time today, which we don't have, and ask you, where do you think Florida ranks of all 50 states, right? Is our economy really diverse, or is our economy really concentrated in, say, ag, tourism, and construction? Well, the punchline is we're number 26 out of 50. We are right in the middle in the country. So it's no longer true to say we don't have a diversified economy. We're actually right in the middle. Now, do we need to diversify it even more? Of course we do. Huge opportunity for high skill, high wage. Let's go to the next slide. We're not going to go through every data point up here, but I want to draw your attention to the floridascorecard.org, right? And I'm going to actually show you a couple of screenshots from there in a minute. Every month we update hundreds of metrics, what's going on in Florida, from housing starts to poverty rates to tax collection to income migration. We do it statewide, and we also make it available for you, all 67 counties. What I would like to point out on here is, so we've hit 20 million residents. Remember I said earlier we're going to add 6 million more. That's 76% more energy by 2035. That's 20% more water by 2020. And we could have that gap conversation all day long. Those are economic opportunities from our perspective. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is the Florida Scorecard. And don't worry, we're not going through every single tile, but I want to show you, here's our belief. In a world where whether you have an R or a D behind your name is going to depend on whether anybody listens to you or not, we believe that local chambers of commerce, EDCs, regional planning councils, we believe that the nonpartisan organizations like yours and ours, we believe that data, right, is actually going to be what people want next. So if we can all get on the same page about what's the truth, what does the data say, what's the unemployment rate, how many jobs need to be created, where are the economic opportunities going to be, if we can get really good about talking in a common way, it's like that aircraft carrier I told you about with 5,000 outboard motors. When we're talking about the same goals, whether I go to Beth's chamber, whether I go to your regional planning meeting, whether I go to a Kelly's EDC meeting, if there's a way we all can start talking about the same goals and the same metrics, then our elected officials are going to have to start talking about the same language. And when we start saying, hey, we still need 972 jobs in this county in the next 6 months, what are we doing about that? What if that became the common measurement at the county commission meeting, at the local chamber meeting, at the EDC meeting? Then all of you would go from, you'd go to a career source meeting, to a chamber meeting, to a regional meeting, but we would all be talking about same goal. You might think that sounds simple, but it's actually hugely important right now. We can't have hundreds of groups working on hundreds of different goals. So 276,300, if you can see that number up there, that's how many jobs Florida's created over the last 12 months. That number gets updated every month, so if that's something you want to report out. If you want to go, let's go to the next slide. So what you're looking at here, we pay attention to where is income moving to in Florida. So think about W-2s, okay? So everyone in green, which is the entire region that we're in here, you've added more W-2 income has moved into your county last year than moved out. We don't have time to get into where it came from. Biggest percentage is New York. Then you can see New Jersey. I was in Palm Beach County the other day reporting on this, and 2 of the top 5 places that Palm Beach's W-2 income came from, Kelly, it's your fault, but it came from New York. But the next biggest one came from Dade County, right? And then you look, Dade County lost more W-2 income last year than it brought in. And so we can do this statewide. Let's go to the next slide. So remember I talked about economic diversification earlier? Well, now we can also take that down to the MSAs. So we have 22 MSAs. They don't fit perfectly over the 4 counties that we're in right now, and I apologize, that wasn't my decision, so to speak. But if you look at where we are, look at the region we're in, you know, you have a county that's the 18th, that 18th most diverse, and then you have a couple counties together that are 14, and then Palm Beach is part of that MSA where that's the 4th. So Gainesville, where the University of Florida is the least diversified economy in all of Florida. Next is the Villages, and after that would be Bay County, Panama City. So again, we don't have time to get into what makes this true, but you need to know you're in, you know, Palm Beach is a very diversified economy. The further north you go, the less diversified you get. So there might be a goal, if you're in Palm Beach, there might be a goal of how do you keep that and sustain it. If you're further north, you might be saying, wait, what do we need to do to diversify our industry mix where we are right now? Let's go. And I'm sorry, it's probably hard for you to read this, and so Michael can make this available later, but what we did is we took all the counties, all 4 counties, and we rolled up into where are you, how many jobs need to be created in each county by 2020, how many by 2030, what's the population going to look like out to there, and then by the way, what's our poverty rate in each county? Poverty rate's unbelievably important. Because remember what I said earlier about the federal entitlement programs and the money that's not going to be available? Well, a lot of that federal entitlement money are going to people that are in poverty. So what are we going to do in our communities to change that scenario, right? Nobody's going to do it if we don't do it. It's hugely important. What I wanted to show you here is this region needs to create 66,000 jobs by 2020 to stay at a 5% unemployment rate and a couple 100,000 jobs by 2030. Here's my point. We know all of this. I'm going to repeat it one more time. Can you imagine if every county commission in Florida, every time they met, started off with this graph? Can you imagine if every local chamber and every EDC did the same thing? What would happen if community leaders, whether you're elected or not, what if we were all looking at the same data? Everybody in here who's ever run a business, you could tell me, how's your business doing? Same store sales, year over year? But why aren't we using a common measurement when we're talking about how we're doing with growing our economy? Let's go to the next one. I talked about demographic changes, and our chief economist calls this the graying of certain counties. Again, hard to read back there, but if you look at the 4 counties we're talking about right now, Palm Beach is going to have an 44.5% increase of 65 and over. That's 135,000 people. You can go all the way up and look at this. Next slide, please. So this is actually just a bar chart of this. See the ones that are going in the wrong direction? You're going to lose 35,000 people, 50 to 59. You're going to add 37, 80 and over. This is out to 2030. So as you're doing your planning, right, most people, highest wage earners are that 50 to 59. You're actually going to lose 35,000 people in this region over this period of time. You want it to be the other way, okay? That's the reality when we do our planning. Let's go. So I'm gonna speed through here, but each county also has your own scorecard. So if you wanted to find out, okay, in Palm Beach, you've created a net, over 9,000 jobs over the last year over year. Let's go to the next one. Indian River, 729 net jobs were created year over year. You can see your unemployment rate there as well. Next. So St. Lucie, 1977. See that top right number of 155? That, on this chart, that's how much W-2 income has moved into the county. So 155 million. If I went back, I'm not going to, but if we went back to Palm Beach, it's over $1 billion of W-2 incomes moved into Palm Beach County over the last 12 months. Pretty good situation to be in. Let's go. And then Martin County, you can see how many jobs, a little over 1,000 jobs. Go ahead. So I'm gonna, I think I have 3 more slides and then I'll let you decide if we have time for questions or not. So the last thing I wanted to give you is where I started, the context of politics. right? I know we're not here today to talk about politics, but we can't make decisions in a vacuum of thinking politicians aren't part of the equation and the pressures on politicians. So some of you know a friend of mine, Mel Sembler. He's one of the biggest names in politics in Florida. And he was quoted a couple months back, "Times have changed, the country's changed, the electorate has changed. I don't understand our country anymore." And Michael, when you put the poll up here about Clinton and Trump, I was in the back, and a lot of people said, "Is there another choice?" Okay? My point is, we have two very unpopular candidates for president, and a big word I hear a lot of is dispirited. A lot of people are just throwing their hands up saying, "I don't even recognize this place anymore. What happened?" Okay? Just understand that's a huge opportunity for all of us in this room to provide leadership. Jobs and entrepreneurship are what made this country great, and it's what's making it great now. Just keep that in mind. Don't let the political stuff. Let's go to the next one. So we ask all the time, what's on the mind of Florida voters? I think this is instructional for you as you go into your conversations today. Still statewide, the number one issue on the mind of voters is jobs. And if you can read this, now it says Palm Beach, that's the media market, right? Don't think about a county. These are the media markets when we do polling and we look at crosstabs. Palm Beach, jobs is number one. Education and healthcare are tied, distant, but they're tied for number two. The only place in Florida where jobs is not the top priority is Tallahassee, the capital, okay? So I just find that really remarkable. And then on the electoral side, you've got about 100,000 more Democrats than Republicans in the four counties, but you're about 10% of the state's voters. Right? So remember, this is a very important part of Florida. You have a very smart guy in our next Senate president who lives here and has his handle on all of this. I think you're going to be well represented. Let's go. So here's how I'm going to end. So what do we do with all of this? So our foundation is in the middle of $1.5 million 2-year research project. It's called Florida 2030. And we're going to all 67 counties. And we're essentially asking, what do we need to do to make Florida more competitive? How do we succeed? We also have a team of researchers doing the qualitative research. What are other countries doing? What's Florida's opportunity in 2030, 2040? What are we going to do with autonomous vehicles? What do you do with electric vehicles that weigh more than any other vehicle but don't pay a gas tax, right? What's the future of Uber? What's the future of this? And that's called Florida 2030. Everybody in here should be involved in this if you're not already. Next slide. So here's a heat map. If it's in green, we've already been to that county with at least one regional town hall meeting. If it's shaded in beige, it's scheduled. If it's red, we don't have anything scheduled yet. We're going to be in every county at least once. Some counties 5, 6, 7 times. So by all means, if you haven't taken advantage of this, just look up Florida 2030 on our website. It's super easy to get involved. Have over 100 organizations already involved in this. The results of this will be unveiled in 2018. We do this every 10 years. It's a massive undertaking, and it'll really be the next strategic plan for the state of Florida. So think of it that way. Okay, I think I just have my email address up next. Let's go to the next one. So that is my email address, mwilson@flchamber.com. Very accessible. And so, Michael, I'm going to leave it in your hands. And I know we're out of time. So where do you want to take it from here?
Anybody have a question? One amazing question. Come to the microphone. Make it a smart one.
Since you've pointed out that this particular area has a trending as an older demographic, which to me suggests retirees, which to me suggests more doctors and nurses, which may not be what you want to hear if you're talking about diversifying the economy. What areas of Florida in the future have the youngest shift in demographics, and how would areas like ours, which are shifting older, compete with them to attract new business?
Yeah, sure. So that's a really great question. So I think if you, on the age side of the equation, if you look at places like Orlando, look at places like Miami, the places that have the most diversified economies are in fact attracting all the generations, okay? But it's a little bit of a misnomer. You didn't say this, but I want to say it. It would not be true to assume that just because someone's north of 50, 60, 70, 80, that they're not contributing to the economy. So I think what we really need to look at is we need to reverse ask the question, what's the economic opportunity for an aging population? And obviously healthcare, right, is a giant opportunity. How do you connect research with healthcare? I think the Burnham conversation right now is a major league setback, a real setback and a perceived setback. But I'll also tell you something else. We have more people who have run successful businesses in America that are retiring early to this area and realizing that they're failing at retiring. These are people who know how to start and run businesses. And what we need to do, my opinion, our opinion, the research shows, is you really can't change the makeup of what you have. So you didn't say this again, but a lot of times people say, well, then how do we be more like Orlando, or how do we be more like Miami, or how do we be more like Austin, or wherever? You don't. You be more like your potential. And to be more like your potential, you have to figure out, you have to look at those demographic shifts, and you have to say, okay, so we're losing a bunch of 50 to 59s. There's really not anything, you're not going to change losing 35,000. But what's the economic opportunity, using the education institutions you have, using your base, what's the economic opportunity for that? That's the answer to the question. That's what we're trying to solve ourselves. So, look, I know we're out of time. That's my email address. Look, what you're doing here is consequential. And I just want to thank you for doing it. You are in a very, very small minority of leaders in Florida who are investing their lives, not just their day, their lives in trying to secure Florida's future. And for that, we owe you a debt of gratitude. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it.